Hey friends, welcome back to the 1 year Bible journey. I'm Pastor Cary. This is the Growing in the Gospel YouTube channel. We are in the New Testament today for week 34. 34. So congratulations. You've come 34 weeks into our 52-week journey, and I'm sure you've had some reason along the way to drop off and fall off the wagon. Frankly, I have too. There have been some times I thought, oh my goodness, I bit off more than I could chew. I'm juggling a lot in life, and yet this project was something I wanted to give myself to. I want to get it done. I'm with you. I am pressing forward like you are. So thank you for taking the journey with me. We have covered so much ground, and I'm so excited about it. So this week in your Old Testament, you finished Proverbs, or will. You will read the entire book of Ecclesiastes, and you will read the first two chapters of Song of Solomon. In your New Testament reading, just a handful of chapters, you're going to finish the book of 2 Corinthians, and you're going to get into the first two chapters of the book of Galatians. And then you're going to read Psalms 101 and 102. So let's dive into the New Testament today. And I'm going to finish up 2 Corinthians with you. And then we're going to begin the book of Galatians together. One of the greatest books in the entire Bible, Galatians, this little letter to the Galatian Christians. So we already set up 2 Corinthians. The relationship between Paul and the Corinthian church has been fractured. There's been a lot of back and forth, rebuke, correction. The church had a lot of problems. The relationship was then divided, seriously divided. It threw Paul into a season of despair. He sent Titus to try to resolve matters. Titus did a pretty good job of doing that. Later found Paul and told him. The church received correction well. They are on the good footing now. They love you. And Paul's planning to visit. So he writes this letter, this second. It's actually his third or fourth letter to Corinth. We talked about that. So you're going to pick it up this week in chapter 11, and you want to remember the tone of this book is really relational. Paul is kind of bouncing all over the place. It's very fluid. He's jumping from topic to topic. In overarching ways, he is confirming and sort of defending himself. He's writing the record from all the false and bad information and all the skewed information that they received from false teachers and bad influencers about him. And he's trying to recapture, regain, restore some of the relationships. So you're going to see that. In chapter 11, he continues to essentially defend his ministry. His tone is gentle, but his motive is, hey, this is who I am. This is what I did. This is the life I showed you. By contrast, and he's contrasting himself in chapter 11 to those who came in as false teachers. And he is listing his qualifications. He's listing his experiences. And he's saying, hey, I've got a lot of things like those people do of which I could boast, but look how I've laid those things down. And I am boasting in the cross. I'm boasting in the gospel. I am pursuing Christ and loving you. And so he's contrasting himself with these other false teachers and bad leaders. And honestly, the nature of this book for the modern believer is it would equip any modern believer to be on guard against exploitative leadership, false teachers, and those with impure motives, those who would use and abuse and misuse their position in ministry to mislead God's people. So I love the nature of this letter because it does really bolster us and equip us with discernment for what does authentic, what does sincere leadership look like. It also shows us, as in Paul's life, God uniquely qualified him for the life of service that he had. So it is with you and me. Well, when you move to chapter 12, Paul moves into sharing his vision of heaven, and there's this beautiful passage about Paul's thorn in the flesh, and his beseeching or begging God to take it away, but God saying, no, I'm going to leave that because I want you to learn about weakness. I want you to learn that my grace is sufficient for you in your weakness, that you walk in weakness, you live out of weakness, you serve out of weakness, you live out of weakness, get used to weakness, because when you are weak, then I can be strong through you. What a great passage. Paul shares with them in chapter 12 his burden to come and visit them and to be a blessing and not a burden to the Corinthians, again, showing the heart of a sincere leader. He had been a burden necessarily. He had corrected, rebuked, and instructed them, which brought burden to them. But he doesn't like to be a burden. He doesn't like to press them. He doesn't like to have to bring correction and rebuke. Paul was at heart an encourager, an optimistic, faith-filled, I'm cheering you on kind of leader. And so he still is of a tone that he's clearing the record, he's expressing his heart, he's sharing the sincerity of his life and motives and leadership. And he's still at the end of this chapter hoping that some of the stragglers will genuinely repent of their sin habits and get back into a good lane of growing with the church body. Well, you come to chapter 13, the final chapter of this letter. Paul is just closing the letter out with some final challenges and admonitions and greetings. And then you're going to move on to the book of Galatians. So I need a few minutes to tell you where you're headed in the book of Galatians. The theme of this book is living by grace. Living by grace. This book is where we all live. We desperately need this book. So Galatia, let's talk about Galatia. First, let's talk about the author. Paul is continuing here. This is the same man writing this letter, this epistle. Remember, the word epistle means letter. There are 6 chapters to this book, so it's a short letter. It's written to the churches of Galatia. Now, this is interesting. You'll remember our journey through Acts. Paul and Barnabas, his buddy, were ministering at the church at Antioch, which is in modern-day Far East Turkey and southern eastern part of Turkey, right where the Syrian border is, really. So this church at Antioch was a great church, a diverse church, a balanced church, a biblical church. They just got it. They got the gospel. They got relationships. They were healthy. They were thriving. They were growing in the Word of God. They were living in the liberty and freedom of the gospel. They were honoring God. They were advancing the gospel. Great church. And the Spirit of God sweeps in and says, separate, this is Acts 13, separate Barnabas and Saul to the work whereunto I have called them. So Paul, by the way, Saul is the Jewish version of his name. Paul is the Greek version of his name. So he ended up later going by Paul because he was ministering to the Gentiles. It was a name that was more readily received by those he was ministering to. It cooperated with the work of the gospel in the lives of non-Jewish people. So that's an interesting side note. But at that moment in chapter 13 of Acts, the church at Antioch comes together. They lay their hands on Paul and Barnabas, and they probably sorrowfully send them away. They send them. And so in that first journey, they set sail across the Mediterranean to the island of Cyprus. They have John Mark with them. This is Barnabas' nephew. They get done in Cyprus, they go north. Now they're going up into central Turkey, southern central Turkey. And this is the region of Galatia. So they go to a handful of different cities, Antioch, Pisidia, Lystra, Iconium, Derbe. I think there's 1 or 2 in there that I'm missing. But they go right into that southern central part of Turkey, modern-day Turkey. At the time, it was called Asia Minor. Or Galatia. So Galatia is a province, and this is now years later. Paul went through there and built and established churches, preached the gospel. Jews and Gentiles were coming to Jesus. He had a rough time of it. He had some persecution. He was stoned along the way. Timothy was saved along the way. And on the second journey, they come back through there and they bring Timothy with them going forward. So some good things happened. It was a hard journey. Paul probably got a little PTSD, but as he went one direction and then reversed course and came back through, he was confirming and affirming and strengthening the churches and appointing leaders and teaching them how to go forward. And God made just some amazing things happen in a relatively short time. Paul and Barnabas Mark left them halfway through the journey, but Paul and Barnabas ended up going back to Antioch and sharing the good news of all that God has done on this first missionary journey and how the Gentiles were coming to Christ and how God was bringing them into the gospel. Well, everywhere that Paul went, there was this group of people following him that were Jewish believers. So they had professed Christ, but they were very well steeped and devoted to their Jewish traditions, and they were convinced that it was necessary to believe in Jesus, but there was more to it than that. You might say this was the very first iteration of the full gospel movement. Well, it's good that you believed in Jesus, but there's so much more that Paul didn't tell you, and that's so necessary. You're really not right with God. You're really not able to grow. You're really not able to be fully saved and fully experience all that God has for you unless and until you not only convert to Christ, but until you convert to Jewishness, until you come into the Mosaic laws. That word Mosaic is confusing to new believers. It's the root of the word is Moses. Okay, it has nothing to do with modern art, as we use the word by another definition, a mosaic. The Mosaic law is the law of Moses. So this goes back to the Old Testament and especially has to do with circumcision. This was an outward sign of Jewishness and covenant relationship with God. And in the Old Testament, it was required of Jews to be circumcised. This was God's requirement for them as his covenant people. Well, in the New Testament, and by the way, even in the Old Testament, nobody was ever saved by being circumcised. They declared their Jewishness by being circumcised. It was an outward sign of an inward reality, but this was not necessary for salvation. Salvation's always been by grace through faith, okay? Salvation's always been by grace through faith, and yet these Judaizers are coming in after Paul teaches and preaches the gospel and teaches these Gentiles they don't have to become Jewish to know God. They can know God through Jesus by faith, and they can remain Gentile because God's broken down all those cultural barriers with the one gospel. And all those that come to God by faith are received by God in faith, in new life, in grace, and they're now able to grow up in grace, in a grace relationship with God and not a law relationship with God. In other words, they can know and love and relate to God and be transformed by the power of his grace, not by the burden or the bondage or the enslavement of keeping Old Testament Jewish laws, to which they have no cultural connection. So these are not moral laws like killing and adultery and lying and stealing and things like that. Those moral laws come forward, and though we don't have to keep them to be saved, they still are God's boundaries and God's framework for how life works, and so they still are the right way to live. But what we're talking about here is the motive that drives that living and the power that brings transformation into our lives. And the Jews had become convinced that keeping these laws, the sacrificial system, the Jewish feasts, the Jewish holy days, circumcision, and the Mosaic law, that keeping that law made them more spiritual, made them more honorable to God, made them more acceptable, brought them God's blessing, brought them God's favor, in a sense, made them more saved. So they believed that salvation was by grace through faith in Jesus, but then they immediately swept in this works-based system that if you were a true believer, you had to conform to before you were fully acceptable to God. The modern word for this is legalism. Legalism simply means having a law-based relationship with God. And there are two modern iterations of legalism, broadly speaking, and I've taught much about this on this channel, so you could find other videos about this on this channel. But law-based relationship with God, legalism, has two expressions. The first is that you are saved by keeping laws of any kind. And when it comes to relating to God, there's only two systems, and there's only really two. Of all the religions in the world, there's only two. I call it do or done. That's why I wrote a little book called Done. The do religions are those that say, here's the things you have to do, here's the laws you have to keep, here's the behaviors you have to achieve before God will save you. We would call this a works-based relationship, or a works-based salvation, or a law-based living. And so this is false teaching, because God says it's not by the works that we do. It's not by keeping the law. It's not by works of righteousness that we are saved, but it is by grace through faith we are saved. So the only other alternative to a works-based relationship or works-based salvation is a grace-based salvation. Grace-based salvation says we don't do the work. Jesus already did the work. We receive the work. We don't achieve the work. We are conferred with salvation as a gift. It is received by belief, by faith, by trust. When we genuinely trust, God counts our belief as righteousness, as justification. We are justified with God by our belief, by our faith. And the very first people to experience this were, I believe, Adam and Eve, because God taught them about blood sacrifice and about atonement and clothed them in the skins of sacrificial animals. I believe he taught them the gospel. One of the very first characters that we read in Scripture that expressed this kind of faith was Abraham. Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. This was before Abraham was called Jewish, before Abraham was brought into circumcision or a covenant kind of law, before God brought him into the circumcision, many years before. He believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. And actually, Paul's going to use that to build this case. So back to the case at Galatia. Let me come back to my two iterations of modern day legalism. So the one brand says you're saved by keeping laws. The other brand is more like the Judaizers, and I would say there's a modern form of Judaizers. They're not bringing people into Judaism, but they're bringing people into law-based systems, very much like Judaism. So they might as well be modern day Judaizers. These Jews would come into the places where Paul had preached the gospel and established churches. They weren't starting their own churches. They weren't reaching their own believers and discipling their own people. They were just simply they were leeches. They were parasites. They were coming in after Paul left town, sweeping in, going, "Hey, we're glad that Paul came in, and we're glad that he taught you the gospel. But there's so much more that he didn't tell you." And that's why we're here. We're here to tell you the full gospel. We're here to tell you what you really need to know, the important information. And by the way, we've written a book. The modern iteration of this is so common, where new believers are brought to Christ in a thriving, healthy church, but then somebody sweeps in. It's very common on YouTube. It's very common in television and broadcast media, or new books, new thoughts, new ideas. Hey, did you know? Have you ever thought? And all of a sudden there's new information. And the grace that saved you, the simple gospel wherein you stood, suddenly you're drawn away into some fringe perspective, fringe opinion that becomes a form of tradition, strong opinion, legalism. And now, though you're saved by grace through faith, you really have this new standard, this new tradition, this new high bar by which you're judging everybody else. And everybody else has to conform to that new bit of information, or that new law, or that new reality, to really be in favor with God, to really be fully saved, fully experience God's blessing, or to be as spiritual as you. And so churches are divided this way, and legalism creeps in the second iteration of, well, you're not saved by works, but you really do have to relate to God. God really wants to relate to you on the basis of what you're doing for him. And if you'll keep our new list, or if you'll do our new traditions, or if you'll embrace this new information that nobody's ever seen before, we just have fresh eyes, and boy, now we really get it. Now live up to this. And this is new forms of bondage, and people by the thousands are brought into these false teachings, these extra biblical teachings, and it's a new form of legalism. And so let me say it this way: legalism says you're saved by works. Legalistic says you relate to God on the basis of your works, or you relate to other people on the basis of their works and your works with them. So legalistic structures are, number one, they're bondage. You are now God's employee or God's slave in a negative way. I'm not talking about a bondservant, but you're really in bondage to God, and he is driving you like a taskmaster and doesn't bless you or accept you unless you really keep his laws. That's a terrible, terrible life to live. And Paul tells us in this book that God doesn't want that kind of relationship with us. He wants a familial, he wants a fatherly relationship with us. He wants us to relate to him as children of the household who are fully loved and fully accepted unconditionally, and who are growing up in his grace and learning to live in honor to him and behave well and honor him in our behaviors by the law of love that has saved us, and not by the laws and dictates and demands of pressure and stress and legalistic relationship. Legalistic communities, church communities, are highly competitive and comparative. We're better because we look this way, act this way, talk this way, do these traditions, do these. I'll give you a simple example. There are sometimes believers that get into the Old Testament and they read about Jewish festivals and Jewish holy days, and suddenly they're like, why aren't we keeping these? And they suddenly create new laws that Christians today, modern day Christians, should be keeping all these feasts and festivals, which exactly expressly is against the instruction of the New Testament, where we're told that we don't have to do that. This book is one of the books that teaches us that. And it's kind of funny because, like, if you just want to keep the Jewish festivals, go for it. There's nothing wrong with that. It's kind of fun or cool to think we're free to do that, but we certainly don't have to do that. We're not obligated to do that. We're not required to do that, to be loved and fully embraced and accepted and favored and brought into the family of God. In the book of Galatians, the big law that they made a huge deal out of was circumcision. So they would come in after all these believers had trusted Christ, and they'd say, oh, that's wonderful, but you all need to be circumcised. Well, Paul had specifically said they don't need to be. And so this new information is confusing, and the Galatians, they get swept up in it. They get drawn away. And so Paul writes this letter, and he comes out swinging. This is a firm, correctional, directive letter, and he's trying to combat the bad information of the Judaizers and the conflict that's coming in to the Gentile church between Jews and Gentiles. And he's trying to break down the legalism that's crept in. And what I want to say as I wrap up today is that legalism, we're all prone to this. We're all prone to begin, number one, we're prone to try to be saved by our works. And you cannot be saved by keeping your works. There are many works-based systems in religious structures today. They're all oppressive. They all laden you with hard work that you can never keep, laws you can never keep, hard work you can never finish. You never do enough. But because you can keep some of the laws, you live with this sense that you're doing pretty good. It's just a very deceptive system, and it's going to make you proud on your good days and depressed on your bad days. Okay, when you're keeping your own laws, you're going to think you're doing good, hitting it out of the park. When you're failing and struggling, you're going to think God is upset at you and has forsaken you. And it's just an emotionally up and down. It's a spiritually volatile life that ends by hitting a wall of I'm tired. That's why Jesus said, come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. What's he saying? I'm going to do the hard work. Get into my yoke. My yoke is easy. My burden is light. It doesn't mean you don't grow up in grace and learn to live a life that honors God, because Paul says in Galatians, don't use your liberty as an occasion to the flesh. Don't use the grace of God as an excuse to sin and dishonor God. That's not the point. Let grace motivate you. Let love change you. Let love motivate you, and don't bring yourself into bondage to systems and traditions that don't make you better. Keeping laws don't make you better. Change of heart is what makes you better, and it's only the grace of God, Spirit of God, by faith in Christ, that grace can unfold in your life and make you a different person. So let's break the book down. You're only going to get to the first 2 chapters this week, so we've laid the groundwork. And chapter 1, Paul says, I'm writing to the churches of Galatia. He comes out swinging. I marvel, I'm shocked, I'm amazed that you have received another gospel. You see, legalism, he says, is another gospel. It's a gospel of human achievement. which the word gospel means good news, so I don't even like calling it a gospel. It's just not good news. A human achievement religion is not good news. It's good advice. And so gospel it's not even the right word to use. But Paul calls it another gospel, so I guess we're on safe ground there. So he begins to dismantle all the bad teaching this church has received. Chapter 2, he tells his own story of Barnabas, Titus, and himself traveling to Jerusalem. He says, we met with the leaders of Jerusalem. They agreed with us that Gentiles do not need to convert to Jewishness. They don't need to keep Jewish laws. And even while we're meeting with them, some tried to sneak in and corrupt our message and take away our liberty, but we did not relent. We did not give in. Then he continues the story that when James, Peter, and John affirmed and encouraged their work. Why would he do this? He's letting the believers, the Jewish believers especially, in Galatia, know that this originates in Jerusalem. Okay, the church has affirmed this. The leaders of the church, the apostles of Jesus, have affirmed this. Then he tells the story, interesting story, and your reading is going to end here this week, of when Peter came to visit him in Antioch. That when Peter first arrived, because, Peter has gone, we remember the story in Acts, I think Acts 10, where Peter is called up to Caesarea Maritime to reach Cornelius, the Roman centurion, and all of his family. And God says to Peter through the vision, don't call the things I've called clean, don't call them unclean. Hey, Peter, the Gentiles I'm bringing into faith now. So accept it, deal with it, break down your biases, break down your prejudice, break down your racial barriers. We're going to get the Gentiles, and we're going to invite them into the family. So Peter knows God's position on this, and when he gets to Antioch, he sits down and eats with Gentiles, which was against Jewish laws. They're considered unclean, sinful people that God rejects. So this prejudice is thick with Jewish people, even Jewish Christians. But he sits and eats with Gentile believers, has no problem with it. But later, other Jews come from Jerusalem and their leaders, and when they get there, Peter pulls back. He's playing out of both sides of his mouth. He's living a double life. When they get there, he acts like he never did that and like he doesn't eat with the Gentiles, and he gets all stuffy and uppity and Jewish again. It's kind of funny to think about these leaders of the early church struggling with the fear of men, struggling with these duplicitous lives. Well, when he did that, it affected other people, and other Jews pulled back from the Gentiles, including even Barnabas. And so Paul, in front of everybody, asks him, why are you doing this? And think of the embarrassment of this moment where Paul, in courage, confronts one of the leaders of the New Testament church in front of a crowd about his own duplicity and says, hey, last week you were eating with all the Gentiles. Today, in the presence of all these new Jewish leaders, you act like you weren't. Why are you doing this? What a moment that must have been. So this is a great chapter because it's a thick moment where Paul is kind of setting free the Gentile world. You're going to read these verses in chapter 2, verse 15. We who are Jews by nature and not sinners, there's kind of quotes over that, sinners of the Gentiles. He's talking about the racial, divide. Knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ. Even we have believed in Jesus, that we might be justified by the faith of Christ and not by the works of the law. For by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. These are two of the most significant verses in all the Bible, but especially in this letter. So this letter, let me wrap up by saying this letter is not a license to go out and do whatever we want under the guise of grace. Some people take grace and they radicalize it to exploit God, to take advantage of his grace. But Paul in Romans says, shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. That mentality is foreign to a grace life. The Spirit of God would not create that desire or that will or that mindset. I'll just go live an unholy, reckless, self-destructive life because I can. That would be using our liberty in Christ as an occasion to the flesh to gratify our flesh. But we're taught to crucify our flesh, to let our flesh be crucified with Christ and to grow up in new desires, driven by love, empowered by grace in the Spirit of God, and let a true naturally transforming work unfold. I told a story some time ago on the channel. Forgive me if I've already told this in the one-year Bible journey. I don't think I have, but it bears telling here as we wrap up today. Years ago in my early marriage, Dana, I was a pretty aggressive driver. And the only reason I drove near the speed limit was basically because of laws. I didn't want to get tickets. And I got a number of speeding tickets and tickets for different things as a young man. And I realized, okay, this is working against me. I might as well just start keeping these laws. But I would still drive pretty aggressively when with my family in the car on a trip or something like that. And it made my wife nervous. And I used to say to her, well, that's your problem, not mine. I used to shrug it off. And in doing that, she felt unloved. And this was always a source of kind of low-grade tension between us. She wanted me to give in and drive a little more safely for her and for the kids' sake. And if nothing else, just to give her a sense that I loved her. But all I cared about was getting tickets or not. And so my motivation was simply the law and the penalty of the law. So I would drive well when there was law enforcement around or the threat. And then I would drive my own way at my own will when there was no threat. But then one day God convicted me and he said, do you love your wife? And I said, of course I love her. Well, then, this is one way you can express love to her, but you're not. And so in the way you're driving, it seems like you don't love her. It seems like you love yourself more. And she is interpreting this as unloving. And I'm like, well, that's not what I want to say to her. But God said, that's what you are saying in the way you're doing this, in the way you're responding to her desire by shrugging it off and dismissing it. You are not communicating love. And I'm like, well, Lord, I do love her. Well, then show her love. Like let your love motivate you to give in and live in a way that honors her, acknowledges her, and validates her desires. So, I made a sincere, very sincere, frankly, desire that I was going to drive differently, a decision, I should say. I made a decision that I'm going to drive slower and more safely, and I'm just going to kind of let the pressure valve release a little bit and not be always so much in a hurry. And so I planned a special date night where I was going to kind of roll this out and explain and show Dana the new me. I get in the car, take her on a date. We're driving real slow down the road, and I'm anticipating red lights and stop signs, and I'm driving well under the speed limit. And at first it's painful. I'm having a hard time, but I really want her to notice. And it's kind of funny because she's not noticing. About 20 minutes into the drive, I looked at her. I said, do you notice anything different? At this point, we're on a freeway. Speed limit's 60. I think I'm driving 55. People are just flying by me. It's Southern California. So we are really, I feel like I'm driving like a grandmother. And she's looking at my hair. She's asking if I got a new outfit or cut my hair. Or I had hair back then. She's asking if I wore a new cologne. She's looking for things to notice. And I said, no, it's none of that. I said, I can't believe you're not noticing this. I said, you always notice when I'm doing this wrong, and now I'm doing it right, but you don't notice. And I said, do you notice anything about my driving? And she went, oh, I did. Yes. And she starts to kind of backtrack and goes, no, I did notice. She said, I just noticed I wasn't stressed by the way you were driving. And at that moment, I opened the conversation. I said, listen, I have been kind of withholding on this and stubborn and obstinate because this is the way I like to drive. But I realize God kind of convicted me that this is not showing you love, and that I can show you love in a simple way by just driving more safely and more cautiously and thoughtfully. And so I just want you to know I'm kind of giving myself to that. And she was like, really? And she was delighted by it. And I said, but here's the thing. These are ingrained habits. So I feel like I'm going to fall back on this, but because I'm sincere, but because I'm also, the child of my own struggle, I want to give you permission to call me out on it. And I said, instead of getting offended, if I do drive uncomfortably for you, Instead of getting offended, don't get offended, and don't kind of close up, or don't feel the need to strongly rebuke or appeal. Just remind me, and I promise you, in love, I will just course correct. I've surrendered in this. I don't need to drive 100 miles an hour. I didn't drive 100 miles an hour, but you get my point. I'm being facetious a little bit, using hyperbole, but I don't need to drive this way. I really do want to love you. I do want to show you that love. And so, what happened over the next year or two? I really broke all those habits. Dana only had to remind me a few times. It never caused any tension between us after that, and still hasn't to this day. I mean, I'm talking, we've been married 35 years. This is like 28 years ago or something. And we've never had another conversation really much about it, but I do drive generally tame and reasonable. I'm just not in a hurry, and it's been a long time since I've gotten a speeding ticket. And even those were kind of unintentional, or coming into zones that I didn't see the speed drop from 45 to 35 or something like that. So here's why I'm telling you this silly little story at the end of this video and going over time. You could say that early in my life, I was law-driven, and I was doing the bare minimum, trying to stay out of trouble. And you could say then, because of surrender, because of conviction, because of growth and maturity and learning that love is a better way to live, you could say that now, I transitioned from law-based living to love-based living, grace-based living. And my motivation for keeping the law, that's still out there, by the way, on the freeways and on the roads, my motivation for keeping the law was not staying out of trouble. It wasn't the law itself. It was love for my wife. And that was a stronger and higher and deeper motivation. And so the law at that point became irrelevant because I was keeping it out of my heart. And so in all honesty, you could take down the boundaries and I would still drive the way I drive, because it's not the law that keeps me in bounds. It's love for my wife. And so here's what I would say about your Christian life. And Paul kind of says this in this book. If you need boundaries, then the law is good. The law is teaching you where the boundaries are. It's a taskmaster. It's a tutor teaching you how God wired life to work, and God's laws in that way are good. If you're trusting laws to reform you, to transform you, to save you, to change you, they don't do that. They simply tell you where the cliffs are. So you come to God by faith. You're born by grace through Jesus. And as you grow up in Him and mature in Him, as your love matures, you're going to want to live out of love to God. And as you do that, you're going to begin to naturally want to keep His laws, number one, because they're good for you. I'm talking about His moral laws now. And number two, it's how life works. And number three, they honor and glorify Him and bring Him pleasure. And so you're just going to want to naturally know and discover and walk in those laws or those instructions or those behaviors because you love God. And you're not trying to do it to earn His favor. You're not trying to do it to be saved or stay saved. You're certainly not comparing to anybody else or competing with anybody else. You're kind of free from all that petty childishness. And you're growing up in maturity, and you just want to honor God because you love Him. And you don't feel judgmental towards people that don't live the way you live or don't have the laws that you or the preferences or traditions that you live by. You don't think them as lesser Christians. You think them as equal to you in the grace of God. You're just living in love. And that's the goal of the gospel. That's the goal of the book of Galatians. When Paul says, I'm jealous for you, I want to bring you back out of that bondage. Why would you want to go back and live by those laws when God has made you free? So this book is a wonderful book, and this life in the gospel and in grace is a wonderful life. So grow up in grace, and don't let legalism get its tentacles back around your neck. And when somebody sweeps in with new information and new perspective on the Bible, you make sure you vet it very carefully before you swallow it hook, line, and sinker. There's a lot of bad information out there. And that's one reason I'm doing Growing in the Gospel, this YouTube channel, because I want to make sure that at least you and those others that join us on this channel, we have access to good biblical foundational, gospel-shaped teaching of the Word of God. Hey, share some comments about how God is teaching you through this journey. You are now completed with week 34. Go get some ice cream today to celebrate that. Have a great day. I'm praying for you all. We'll see you tomorrow.